Let me just ask you, first of all, what are your impressions of what we've been seeing here so far? We're nearing the end of the summit.
This is a good opportunity for us to roll out the first part of the peace vision, and it starts with the economic piece. And we've had so many countries and people who've come here to look at a future of prosperity and dignity for the Palestinian people. I'm the U.S. envoy for Iran, and the Iranian regime is afraid of this succeeding. They would much rather have the Palestinian people trapped in an endless cycle of poverty, where ideology is prioritized over the welfare of the Palestinian people. It's the same model that they use in Iran, where they export ideology and revolution. They rob their own people blind. They enrich themselves, but their own people suffer. So we're very happy with how we've been able to roll this out and look forward to what's next.
So, Brian, you mentioned sort of the key word here, which is Iran. There's obviously a big commonality between a lot of the people here who aren't necessarily usually in the same room together, and that's concern over Iran. How much is that actually a topic of discussion here?
Well, you know, when we had a global ministerial on Warsaw, Poland, and we had Arab nations together, we had the Prime Minister of Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and when the Arab ministers and the Prime Minister were at a dinner, they were talking about what are the challenges facing the Middle East, and the number one issue is the Iranian regime's aggression. And so whether it's the Iranians using Syria to attack Israel or the Iranians using Yemen to attack Saudi Arabia, it's still Iran destabilizing this region. So this is a great chance for a lot of countries to come together. Many of them were at Warsaw to talk about how we're going to make progress on the Palestinian, Israeli context, but also how do we deter Iranian aggression?
Is the United States, or you personally, do you feel like you're getting the support that you need, that the U.S. needs from allies that aren't necessarily just in the Gulf, but also in Europe, for example?
Chancellor Merkel identified Iran as responsible for the attacks of May 12th. And the UK foreign minister also identified Iran as responsible for the attacks. There is no question who is the threat to freedom of navigation in this region. We're in Bahrain today. This is my 5th country, and in every stop that I made, meeting with foreign ministers and other ministers, they've expressed unequivocal support for President Trump's policy to Iran. We are trying to change the paradigm. Iran has a 40-year paradigm of using terrorism as a tool of statecraft, and we have put in place such enormous pressure on Iran to change its behavior. This is the right policy at the right time, and we are committed to this campaign of pressure to deter Iranian aggression and to change its behavior in a fundamental way.
What would you say to those who say, look at what we've seen recently? I mean, over the last few weeks, the U.S. and Iran have come maybe the closest ever to open conflict. We've seen those attacks on oil tankers. You mentioned Iran shooting down an American drone, a near U.S. response. It doesn't seem like Iran is backing down. It seems like the opposite, that they're becoming more provocative. So could that be a sign that the policy isn't working?
I think Iran's provocations are a sign that our sanctions are hurting them. Qasem Soleimani doesn't like to be told no. Iran, I would say, for the last, from about 2007 to 2017, was able to run a violent and expansionist foreign policy without much pushback. Nobody was telling them no. And in fact, the prior administration sought an accommodation with Iran, and they told nations in the region that they're going to have to share it with the Islamic Republic of Iran. We're taking an entirely different approach. There is no acceptable level of lethal assistance that the Iranian regime can provide to Hezbollah. There is no acceptable level of lethal assistance that Iran can provide to Hamas. They have got to stop funding terrorist proxies. They have got to stop organizing, training, and equipping these proxies. Iran has done this for so long. I think many nations in the world have become desensitized to the violence of 40 years. We are not desensitized to it, and we're taking an entirely different approach.
Let me just ask you one final question on that note. You mentioned Hamas and Hezbollah. Obviously, Israel is number one, maybe, in terms of the concerns about those two groups because they're on two of their borders. For Israel that's concerned potentially that an escalation between the U.S. and Iran could end up having those proxies actually react from Israel's north, from Israel's south, what would you tell them?
Well, Israel has been a fantastic partner for the United States. Ambassador Bolton was just there. I was recently there meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And so we're in this together. And I think when you want to do something historically significant and something really a significant change in Iran's behavior, there are going to be some tense moments. But the Iranian regime does not get a veto over American national security and Israeli national security. And so one of the nice things that I've seen in this role, Iran's foreign policy has brought together Arabs and Israelis in ways we never thought possible. And so that's a gift from this regime. And so we're going to leverage that. We're taking full advantage of it. We saw it in Warsaw. We've seen it here. We're going to continue with this work. And we think that that sort of work, I wouldn't describe it as normalization, but it's becoming the new normal. Because when you talk to all of the countries in the Middle East today, what they want to talk about is Iran's aggression and their missile program and their nuclear program. And together we're working to fight it.
All right, Brian Hook, thanks so much for taking the time.